Complete Unknown is the latest Bob Dylan biopic from director James Mangold. But is it worth your time? Welcome to Cinema, where we focus on the film. I'm Josh, this is Simply Cinema. Let me know in the comments below. Have you seen A Complete Unknown? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Or is it somewhere right in the middle? Make sure to like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. And getting right into the synopsis. Taking on the landscape of New York in the 1960s, Bob Dylan comes into town going on about his music career and goes about to change cultural movement on America. Taking it right into positive, this is a great Bob Dylan biopic that me personally, I'm not particularly familiar with him as a music artist. I probably heard some of his songs in the background now and then. I'm not particularly well versed within this, but I still went in knowing this could be a source of entertainment and something that still educates, knowing that this is James Mangold's sort of passion project to some degree. He's done a biopic before on Johnny Cash, and sort of related and connected in some ways is Bob Dylan, this music artist that has gone through different cultural movements within the way that he's changed music as a whole, certain elements of rock and roll, things that go about along the lines of that. There's many moments where we portray and go about with many different songs from him. Some musical biopics do a little bit of a minimum to that degree, and so there was something that was captivating and interesting just from learning some of his music that I didn't necessarily hear before, but some things that sounded familiar to some degree. Timothee Chalamet is something that's great within this cast, Edward Norton especially as a side supporting cast. But what we're getting, Timothee Chalamet, while I don't always know the mannerisms of Bob Dylan, how he acted, other things, it's something that still felt like a strong portrayal of this particular music artist that also went along this complicated life. Other girlfriends, Elle Fanning was great, and other ones that worked about along the way. The supporting cast was just as good for the way they pulled off all these different sceneries, these environments, these concerts, other elements of intrigue within the cultural movement. I wasn't necessarily expecting different things, different inserts of the cultural revelations at that time for what we're getting out of the story. So it was informative for the nature of what the impact of everything came about along the way, which was good for how the story was built up. The structure was interesting by the way that it became unique, not necessarily familiar to the biopic standards, so that's something that made it stood out just a little bit more. James Mangold is a great director. He's done Logan, he's done The Wolverine, and like I said, he's done the Johnny Cash biopic called Walk the Line, and things that go about along the way with that. His directing has been great. The landscape, everything, the scenery, and also the costumes just make this feel transformed, brought to life, and become something that is something that sucks you into the world while also being educational to some degree. Or for people that are fans of Bob Dylan, maybe it goes without saying that you'll very likely enjoy what you get out of the music standards, everything that comes about throughout this, different questions of how and who Bob Dylan was, his revelation that he changed with culture, and the exploration of culture at that time looks good for the nature of how that was set up as a whole throughout the story. But getting into the mix elements, for me, as someone that wasn't fully aware of who Bob Dylan was, this is not something that I feel would impress on someone as something to look at, watch, and know everything about him or everything about that time. So I will be trying to do a bit more research. But for those that also aren't familiar with Bob Dylan, if you want to spend time, this is a good starting base to who he is. It's not a documentary. Certain things can be dramatized. That's not a negative aspect. It's an aspect of entertainment, but it's something that I want you to be aware of if you're going into it, that it it may not fully work for you depending on what all you're expecting. There's parts to the structure that are a little out of place and untraditional for the biopic standards, so it can throw you off, but there are inserts of different things, different particular topics going on at that time, the change of president, other things going on in the course of history. So it's not a straight through plot that, well, yes, it's not going through flashbacks, going back and forth. There's parts that flow on throughout that sort of can jump from time to time, and so it can be a little bit jumbled to some extent. And I want you to be aware that going into it, even if you are familiar with Bob Dylan, it's not fully traditional in the way it goes about a through story structure. There's different characters here and there that especially the side characters, the people of history, it feels more real, which is good. But at the same time, if you're looking at a through plot that becomes entertainment, you have to remember other characters that came up, who they were to begin with. This is going to be jumping around from part to part for different characters that aren't going to be showing up every little ounce of the way because of the nature of, even if they're a supporting member of Bob Dylan's life, they weren't always there for every step of his way. And so it's going to sometimes jump from one scene to maybe 30 minutes later they show up again. So something to expect is a little bit of a jumbled plot, even if it's not necessarily narratively inaccurate by the timeline that it is basing off of. Getting right into negatives, while I wasn't particularly bored at any time, the duration can be lengthy to some extent, which can cover quite a bit of his life, or at least in this period that I was showing. It's not covering his childhood, it's focusing on this one part from the early 60s to about 65, and then giving that subtext at the end credits to show you more about where he was led on to be, how he lived out the rest of his life, things that go about along the way. But things that I feel like could be better with this film is having a more defined focus. Like I mentioned, there's a little bit jumbled parts here and there. I know it's not a typical narrative that you're following all these characters. You're not expecting a side character to appear in one scene, then a half hour later show up again. But at the same time, there's something that feels like maybe needs to be cut or more defined in knowing what it's focusing on. Something that leads you to be aware of how things are coming in next. There's certain things where parts of the dialogue lead you to believe something else is coming next, whether it's talking about someone coming that night, but then it jumps to the next day or 2 days from then, and so it feels a little bit jumbled in a sense that even as something that isn't a typical narrative becomes something that certain parts of the dialogue don't need to be as formal or as fleshed out to what it's introducing and then what it goes on to present within the structure of the story, being something that is atypical to the structure. That can be a good thing, but at the same time can throw off the vibe, throw off the flow of going from one scene to the next to looking at the overall grand picture of what it's showing off. It's something that, yes, it can give you a subtext and a cultural understanding of who Bob Dylan was, his revelation. But when there were some of those small moments that jump from part to part, it never necessarily helped you to understand the flow of every piece that was going on, the cultural change and the character change within Bob Dylan as a person going, and that's part of where you may not know he was mysterious, other things people didn't necessarily know about him as a whole, who his girlfriend was, or how that changed from part to part. Elements like that, yes, I get they were part of his life. People may not be able to understand him fully, or however clear that was to the parts of history that were written, parts of history that were passed down. but that's where it throws things off a little bit. It's just the way all the structure was put together. It feels like pieces of information that don't necessarily just bleed out facts. It's something that the performances lead on, the atmosphere and setup can be good and captivating to your attention, but almost feels like a fact-feeding machine to some general sense, in one essence, to where it's not documentary style, but it's a little bit in between and throws off some of the general structure that I may have expected, at least coming in for the first time watch. So that's just my personal review for A Complete Unknown from the director James Mangold, which I have to rate as simply 6.5 out of 10. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of A Complete Unknown. Are you a Bob Dylan fan, or did you go in blind just as well as me? Make sure to like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. So that's just all, and make sure to do yourself a favor and go watch a movie.